Amen. Thank you, Shakayach. So first of all, apologies that we did not arrange this year our usual splendid feast of fruits for Tu B'Shvat. David Katz is the person who normally arranges it. He hasn't yet reappeared post-COVID. Please God, next year we'll celebrate again. But in the meantime, if you happen to come across a tree today, give it a nice hug. What's the old line? I talk to the trees, that's why they took me away. You know, they put you in a straitjacket and they'll take you off to a nice place. At any rate, as you probably know, Tu B'Shvat has one of those festivals which has undergone a number of iterations. It's morphed into something else. Historically, Tu B'Shvat is halachically the new year for trees. And that has an implication for tithing, it has an implication for orana, the counting of the 3 years when you can't have the fruit from a tree. After that, a little bit later on, the 15th century, under the auspices of the Arizal, the Yitzhak Luria took on a mystical dimension as well, and the Tu B'Shvat Cedarim that you have today will all come back to some of those ideas of what lies in the idea of the fruit and of the being able to elevate the sparks of godliness that are within the earth, etc. Latterly, after the formation of the state of the declaration of the State of Israel, Tu B'Shvat took on a more Zionistic dimension, so there became a day to plant trees in Israel, and latterly it has now become the big story about ecology and planting. It's all about the way in which we care for the earth. So Tu B'Shvat has become the ecological festival for the Jews. But the halachic basis remains its essential one, and the reason why the 15th of Shevat was chosen was according to the explanation given by Rashi, because at that point the ground has become saturated with the rains of the new year, and therefore the sap begins to rise in the trees, which means that the fruit can begin to bud. The Jerusalem Talmud gives a different explanation, and it says until the new year all the trees can survive on the water from the previous year. After Tu B'Shvat, the trees derive their life source from the water of the new year. Now, forgive me, Howard, for straying into your territory, but it turns out that according to Reb Levi Yitzchak, that was the Kabbalistic father of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the word Shevat and Ilan have the same numerical equivalent, except that they don't, because the numerical equivalent of Shevat is 311, 3 plus 9 plus 2, and Ilan unfortunately only reaches 91. So on what basis did he say that they have the same numerical equivalent? Well, the point is this, that trees spread out their branches, you see. So if you take the word Ilan and you spread out its branches in the way of, as Howard has explained on many occasions, you take the Aleph and you spell it out in full. So an Aleph is 111, and the Yud spelled out fully is 20, and the Lamed spelled out fully is 74, and the final Nun is 106 when you spell it in full, and you count the etc. And miraculously, when you spell the word Ilan in full, like the spreading out of the branches, it equates to Shevat. There are 10 historic trees in the Torah. Some of them we know about, some of them people won't recognize until I mention them. So the two, of course, which one will know immediately is the tree in the Garden of Eden, the tree of knowledge, and then a little bit later the tree of life. But after that, 10 generations later, remember what happens with Noah, and he sends out the dove and can't find food first, goes out again. What kind of food does it find? It finds the food of an olive tree. It comes back with an olive leaf, which is very bitter at that stage. So that's our third tree. 10 generations later, we have Avram and Sarah, who gives hospitality to the angels. And where does that happen? It happens under a tree. So that's our fourth tree. This one you may not get so easily, but remember after the story of Shechem and the rape of Dinah, Jacob instructed that all of the idols should be buried, and they are buried under a tree, which is close to Shechem, and you see this actually in the Torah. A little bit later on, just a few verses beyond that, we read about Devorah, who's the nurse, Maneket, of Rivka. And she dies, and she is buried in a place called Alon Bachut, the tree of weeping. Yeah, so that's our sixth tree. Of course, the seventh tree is the famous one. It's the burning bush. Okay, not quite a tree, but good enough for our purposes. Okay. And then we have a little bit later, as we come to the parashiyot that we're reading, we have the eighth tree, and that was the tree that sweetened the waters of Marah. When Moses took a branch and he threw it into the water, and the waters became sweetened, a bitter branch. At the same time, the Jews camped at the 70 palms, the Elim, 12 springs of water and 70 palms. And finally, we have one which is there only by way of allusion as the 10th tree, and that is when the Jews come to build the Mishkan. And they have this beautiful cedar wood which they use for the walls. And the question is, where do they find cedar wood in the middle of a desert? And the answer is that Jacob, with foresight long before, had planted cedar trees in Egypt, and he had said to his children that I have a prophecy that when you leave this land eventually, you should take these trees with you. I don't know why, but you have to take these trees with you. So they cut down the cedar trees, and they took them with them into the desert, and it turns out that is what they needed. That is what they used to build the Mishkan. The cedar trees had been planted by Yaakov Avinu with his great presence. 10 trees in the Torah. Well, finally, we have the comforting words of the Meiri, who tells us that's Rabbi Menachem Meiri, 14th century sage, that the winter season extends from the month of Tevet until the month of Nisan, and that the 15th of Shevat is the exact midpoint between autumn and spring. So, in other words, the good news is half the winter has already passed, and the cold is not as intense, and from this point onwards, the budding process begins. So take heart. It might be a little bit chilly out there today, but the 15th of Shvat represents the turning point in the season. And the big lesson, as always, is of 15th of Shevat, that sometimes it is precisely within the darkest and the coldest moments of our lives that the new blossom